For most of the heretics of the early church, we might view them as being a little stupid, small intelligence, maybe a bit dishonest, maybe prideful, maybe just straight up evil. But there was one heretic in the early church that the fathers simply labeled as viscerally disgusting. St. Thomas Aquinas called him an idiot and a blasphemer. St. Ambrose accused him of sacrilege. St. Jerome accused him of impiety. And St. Epiphanius accused him of, quote, a rashness exceeding all bounds. Who was this heretic? This heretic was a Roman layman named Helvidius. Among his many errors, and his most serious error, was the denial of the perpetual virginity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, an impiety that had been unheard of at that point. Interestingly enough, Helvidius was actually the student of a certain Arian bishop named Auxentius of Milan. St. Athanasius actually comments on the character and person of this bishop, and he said that Auxentius was, quote, ignorant of the Latin language and unskillful in everything except impiety, end quote. This, of course, would be something that his student Helvidius would follow him in. When one looks to the works of Helvidius, or rather the works responding to Helvidius, he gives the same stock arguments that we are familiar with today. He points to our Lord being called firstborn, he points to the usage of the word until, he points to the brethren of our Lord, and so on. But he actually makes a very interesting argument for historical pedigree for his position. And this argument would be the claim to be supported by a very important early Christian writer, Tertullian of Carthage. Now, St. Jerome actually responds to this by simply stating that Tertullian of Carthage was not a church father, since he died outside of communion with the church. Now, this is true, since he ended up accepting the heresy of the Montanists. But the unfortunate part of this is that St. Jerome actually didn't directly deal with the claim that Tertullian taught this. Therefore, to this day, heretics will simply reference Tertullian as a gotcha against the perpetual virginity of our Blessed Mother.
We see a development. There's a development from the view of Tertullian, who's before Nicaea, to a view that becomes widespread, and in the end of the 4th century gets challenged by Helvidius, who challenges Jerome, and that is sort of the first real argument on the subject, and Helvidius ends up losing that, and we can't even find his writings. They've all been destroyed, so it's hard to say whether he was actually a heretic or not by judging his own writings.
Early Christian writers of various abilities and levels of knowledge, while clearly affirming the virgin birth of Christ, did not speak of this later concept as part of the gospel. Indeed, one such writer, Tertullian, spoke of Mary's other children with an ease that demonstrates it was not, at the time, a point of contention or argument. Now, Tertullian became a Montanist, and so his testimony is often dismissed without ever explaining to us why it is that he could make the statements he did, and no one even batted an eyebrow.
Yet the idea that Tertullian taught the Helvidian view against the perpetual virginity of the Blessed Virgin Mary is completely ridiculous and lacking all foundation. There are a few texts which are simply quoted in order to support this thesis. So what I wanted to do is, with a critical eye, go through all of these texts and ask the question, do these texts actually substantiate the position that Tertullian denied the perpetual virginity of our Blessed Mother? From this, we'll see the complete opposite, and actually some of these texts support and teach the perpetual virginity of our Blessed Mother. The first text is from Tertullian's On Monogamy. Now, in the early church, there was a certain debate that went on, and this debate was over the status of digamy. Now, digamy is different than bigamy. Digamy is the idea of having a second spouse after your first spouse dies. Bigamy is the idea of having two spouses at the same time. Now, obviously, bigamy has always been rejected within the church, but digamy was hotly disputed within the early church. And this work is Tertullian's take on the matter. Some took the position that digamy was immoral and unlawful. Others took the position that digamy was basically less ideal. Here, Tertullian weighs in on the matter and references a few biblical characters and their monogamy. The text in question is found in chapter 8. It states, quote, "Who is more worthy to initiate the body of the Lord than flesh of the same kind as that flesh which conceived and gave birth to him? Christ was indeed born of a virgin, who would marry once for all after her childbearing, so that Christ might have on his birth certificate a double title of holiness, since his mother was both a virgin and married only to one man." End quote. Here, what Tertullian is doing is simply pointing to the supremacy of monogamy over digamy by using the example of Our Lady, who was only married to one man, Saint Joseph. Now, the Helvidians seek to use this text and argue that, since it mentions her marrying Saint Joseph, that therefore they must have engaged in marital relations. But obviously, this simply doesn't follow. In fact, when we look at the context, this text teaches the exact opposite. First, we can actually refute the supposition that marriage necessarily means engaging in the marital use for Tertullian. Tertullian taught, against certain authors like St. Clement, that only St. Peter the Apostle was married, and that the other apostles were not married. But he also taught that St. Peter, after ascending to the apostolate, did not engage in marital relations, and was continent. If you want to read more about this, there's a very good book by Stephen Hyde called Celibacy in the Early Church. Clearly, Tertullian did not assume that being married means engaging in the marital use. But the more important consideration is actually when we compare the few sentences before this text with the text itself. It states, quote, "Behold, there immediately present themselves to us, on the threshold as it were, the two priestesses of Christian sanctity, monogamy and continence, one modest, in Zachariah the priest, one absolute, in John the forerunner, one appeasing God, one preaching Christ, one proclaiming a perfect priest, one exhibiting more than a prophet, him, namely, who has not only preached or personally pointed out, but even baptized Christ." End quote. We see something very interesting here. Tertullian states that there are two forms of perfection: monogamy, as Zechariah, which means having one spouse, and continence, as St. John the Baptist, which means to be a virgin. When Tertullian speaks of Mary, he actually compares Mary to St. John the Baptist, which is to actually state that she is a perpetual virgin, just like St. John the Baptist was. He then goes on to confirm this by speaking of a, quote, double title of holiness that Mary had. What is this double title of holiness? Well, this double title of holiness is both being a virgin and being the wife of a single husband, that is, being monogamous. And thus she fulfills the perfections found in both St. Zechariah and St. John the Baptist. The heretics are so blinded when they read this passage that rather than realizing that this text is a text which explicitly teaches the perpetual virginity of Our Lady, they twist it to the opposite sense and say that this denies the perpetual virginity of Our Lady. Here he exalts her dignity as both chaste in being a perpetual virgin and monogamous in being married to one husband, that is St. Joseph. So here Mary can actually be a model for both those who are celibate in the church and those who are married in the church. A second series of texts comes from Tertullian's On the Flesh of Christ. In this text, he is actually following a litany of fathers who responded to a heresy called Docetism. Docetism denied that Christ had a real body because they were Gnostics and thought that flesh was evil, and rather thought that he only had a phantom body or an appearance of a body. So the purpose of this text is to simply prove that Christ had real flesh. In the 7th chapter of the work, he deals with a particular exegetical argument from the Docetists. That is the famous question from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, "Who is my mother and who are my brethren?" They reasoned from this passage that our Lord here was implying that he didn't actually have a mother and that he didn't actually have blood relations. And from this, they implied that our Lord didn't actually have flesh. So Tertullian, what he is intending to do here is to show that when he asks, "Who is my mother and who are my brethren?" that the is and the are in that passage does not mean to imply some sort of denial, but rather is a true affirmation. So the entire scope and purpose is to simply affirm that the is and the are indicating true blood relations, which are in line with Christ's true body. So the argument from the Helvetians simply boils down to, he says that they're brethren, therefore he must mean that they are sons of Our Lady. Now this, of course, doesn't follow. Both Catholic and Protestants reading this passage of all sorts and kinds are going to affirm that these are true blood relations, that these are true brethren. Another interesting point to consider is that this actually would be the most obvious place to bring up the Helvetian view if he happened to hold to the Helvetian view, since it would make a very strong argument that our Lord had a true body if Tertullian simply pointed to all of those individuals throughout history that we know who are also children of the Blessed Virgin Mary. But he doesn't do this. Well, why doesn't he do this? Well, he already told us why he doesn't do this. Because he believes that Our Lady was a perpetual virgin. So this argument from the Helvetians simply makes an assumption that they also make in the New Testament text. It is not at all any sort of explicit or implicit proof of the Helvidian thesis. Now, certain Protestants will also point to the 23rd chapter of this same work, but in the 23rd chapter, brethren of our Lord aren't even mentioned. The only thing mentioned in this chapter is that our Lord had a true birth from the Blessed Virgin Mary. It really doesn't have anything to do with the perpetual virginity. The last text that gets brought up is against Marcion, Book 4, Chapter 7. In this work, Marcion is basically giving the same argument as the Docetists earlier, the who is my mother and who are my brethren. Yet again, Tertullian does not give the obvious Helvidian argument that all of these figures throughout the early church that we all know of, these were blood brothers of our Lord, so obviously he was born in a true body. He doesn't state that at all. He merely states that these brothers are, quote, true relations or, quote, blood relations. That's all he says. He says that they're relatives, which everybody agrees with in the first place. But this all, of course, rests on the assumptions of the Protestants. The clear teaching of Tertullian is that Our Lady was both wife and virgin throughout her entire life. And I think this teaches us something important. Oftentimes in theology, there are common historical lies that are passed down from generation to generation. And a lot of time, the apologists like Gavin Ortland or Mike Winger or James White, they simply restate a lot of these old tropes without actually going into the primary sources. Some of these read secondary sources, and some of them even only interact with tertiary sources like videos or debates. What's very important is to not assume that they're representing the primary sources correctly, and actually, in each case, to question what is taught. That's all that I have for you, and as always, God bless.